The basement of the bombed-out apartment building in Brussels smelled of mold and decay. It was October 1943, and Lieutenant Robert Chen of the American OSS crouched in the darkness, listening to footsteps overhead. German patrols had been sweeping the area for 3 days now, ever since the Gestapo had begun their crackdown on the resistance network known as Comet. Chen wasn't supposed to be here. His mission had been simple: parachute into Belgium, make contact with a resistance cell, retrieve a package, and get back to England within 72 hours. That was 6 days ago. Now he was trapped behind enemy lines with information that could alter the course of the war, and every hour he remained increased the chance that he would be caught. The footsteps above moved away. Chen exhaled slowly and checked his watch in the dim light, filtering through a cracked foundation wall. 2200 hours. His contact was late. Very late. The man who finally appeared 2 hours past midnight was not the contact Chen had been expecting. He was younger, perhaps 19, with the kind of lean face that spoke of too many missed meals and too much fear. "Monsieur Robert?" the young man whispered in French. Chen nodded cautiously, his hand resting on the Colt pistol hidden under his jacket. "I am Laurent. Your contact, Marguerite, was arrested yesterday." The young man's voice trembled slightly. "The Gestapo has taken 12 people in the last week. They know about the network. They know about the package." Chen felt ice water running through his veins. "Does Marguerite know where I am?" Laurent shook his head. "No, but they have her courier, a man named Dubois. He knows the safe houses. It is only a matter of time before he talks. Everyone talks eventually." This was worse than Chen had feared. The package he carried was not just valuable, it was potentially war-winning. 3 weeks earlier, a German radar technician named Klaus Hoffmann had defected to the Belgian resistance. Hoffmann had worked at a secret research facility near Peenemünde on the Baltic coast, and what he had seen there had terrified him enough to risk everything. Germany was building rockets, not the small artillery rockets the Soviets used, but massive missiles capable of crossing the English Channel and striking London with devastating force. Hoffmann had brought technical documents, photographs, and detailed specifications for what the Germans called the Vergeltungswaffen II, Vengeance Weapon 2, the V2. British intelligence had been skeptical of early reports about German rocket programs, dismissing them as propaganda or fantasy. But Hoffmann's documents were different. They were technical, detailed, and utterly convincing. If the Germans deployed these weapons before the Allies could develop countermeasures or destroy the launch sites, the coming invasion of Europe could be jeopardized. Chen's mission was to get those documents to England. But now, trapped in occupied Belgium with the Gestapo closing in, that mission seemed impossible. "Can you get me to the coast?" Chen asked Laurent. The young Belgian hesitated. "Perhaps, but the usual routes are compromised. We would have to go through Antwerp, and the Germans have increased security there tenfold. They are searching for you, monsieur. Not just you specifically, but someone. They know an American agent is in Brussels with something important." Chen thought quickly. The Germans knowing about him meant there was a leak in the network, someone talking, or a radio transmission intercepted. Either way, standard extraction routes would be watched. "What about going south?" Chen asked. "Into France." Laurent looked surprised. "France? That takes you away from England, deeper into occupied territory." "Exactly. They'll be watching the ports and the coast. But if we can reach the Pyrenees, there are routes into Spain. From Spain, I can reach Gibraltar and get back to England." It was a desperate plan. The journey would take weeks instead of days, crossing hundreds of miles of occupied territory. But Chen had learned in his 18 months with the OSS that sometimes the best way out of a trap was to go deeper into it, to take the path the enemy considered too dangerous or too foolish to watch carefully. Laurent considered this for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I know a man, a smuggler who moves black market goods between Belgium and France. He is not political, not resistance. He works only for money, but he knows the routes the Germans do not watch." "Can you trust him?" "I can trust that he loves money more than he loves the Germans. That is its own kind of reliability. They left Brussels the next night, hidden in the back of a baker's truck, delivering bread to German garrisons along the French border. The irony was not lost on Chen, traveling to safety by supplying the enemy. But Laurent assured him the baker was reliable, a widower whose son had been killed by the Germans in 1940 and who now aided the resistance in small, careful ways. The journey to the border took 8 hours of bone-jarring travel over roads pitted by years of military traffic. Chen lay hidden beneath sacks of flour, breathing through a cloth to filter the dust, listening to German voices at each checkpoint as the baker presented his papers and joked with the guards. They crossed into France near Lille just before dawn. The baker left them at an abandoned farmhouse where Laurent's smuggler contact was supposed to meet them. But as the hours passed and no one appeared, Chen began to suspect they had been betrayed. He was preparing to leave when he heard the sound of an engine approaching. Chen and Laurent took cover in the ruins of the barn, weapons ready. But the man who climbed out of the battered Citroën truck was no German soldier. He was perhaps 50, heavy-set, with the permanently wary expression of someone who had spent years operating on the wrong side of various laws. He introduced himself simply as Marcel and wasted no time on pleasantries. 10,000 francs, Marcel said flatly. Half now, half when we reach the Pyrenees. If the Germans stop us, I have never seen you before. You are hitchhikers I picked up and knew nothing about. Chen had been given operational funds before his mission, gold coins and French currency that he carried in a money belt. He counted out the first payment, while Marcel watched with the calculating eyes of a man who made his living assessing risk and reward. The journey south took 12 days, that felt like 12 years. They traveled mostly at night, using back roads and farm tracks that Marcel knew from years of smuggling operations. They slept in barns and abandoned buildings, once in a root cellar, while German troops conducted a sweep of the area overhead. Marcel proved to be more than just a smuggler. He had contacts throughout occupied France, a network of people who owed him favors or feared his influence, a farmer who looked the other way when they crossed his land, a village policeman who had been paid to forget certain faces, a garage owner who provided fuel without asking questions. But the closer they got to the Pyrenees, the more dangerous the journey became. The region near the Spanish border was heavily patrolled, and German intelligence had become increasingly sophisticated about monitoring the escape routes used by Allied airmen shot down over France. They reached the foothills of the Pyrenees on November 4th, exhausted and hungry. Laurent had developed fever somewhere south of Lyon, and Chen worried that the young Belgian wouldn't survive the mountain crossing. But Laurent refused to turn back. My brother was killed by the Germans in 1940, Laurent said as they sheltered in a shepherd's hut. My sister was taken to work in a German factory last year. We do not know if she is alive. I will cross these mountains or die trying, but I will not go back. Marcel arranged for a guide, a Basque shepherd named Esteban, who had been leading refugees over the mountains since 1940. Esteban was a small, withered man who spoke little, but moved through the mountains like he was part of them. The crossing began on a cold November night. They climbed in single file, following trails that were barely visible even to Esteban's experienced eyes. The documents Chen carried were wrapped in oilcloth and hidden inside his coat, pressed against his chest where they would stay dry, and he could protect them if they were ambushed. On the second night of the crossing, they encountered a German patrol. The soldiers appeared without warning, emerging from behind a rock formation just as Chen's group rounded a bend in the trail. There were 4 of them, probably a routine patrol unit, checking the mountain passes. For a frozen moment, both groups stared at each other in the moonlight. Then everything happened at once. Esteban moved first, his walking stick swinging in a brutal arc that caught the nearest German across the throat. Marcel pulled a pistol and fired twice, the shots echoing off the mountains like thunder. Chen drew his Colt and shot the 3rd soldier as the man tried to bring his rifle to bear. The 4th German turned to run, probably intending to alert other patrols. Laurent, moving faster than Chen would have thought possible for someone with the fever, tackled the soldier from behind. They struggled on the rocky ground, rolling dangerously close to a steep drop-off. Chen reached them just as the German got his hands around Laurent's throat. Chen put his pistol against the soldier's head and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the mountain silence. They stood there for a moment, breathing hard, surrounded by 4 dead Germans. Esteban was the first to move, already dragging bodies off the trail. "We must go quickly," the Basque said in his heavily accented French. "These mountains carry sound far. If there are other patrols, they heard the shots." They moved at a brutal pace after that, knowing that time was now their enemy. Behind them, they could hear whistles and shouts as other German units began searching for their missing patrol. But Esteban led them off the main trails, through passages that seemed impossible, across ravines and up rock faces that Chen would have sworn were unclimbable. They crossed into Spain 30 hours later, more dead than alive, their clothes in tatters and their hands bloody from the climb. Laurent collapsed as soon as they reached the Spanish side, his fever breaking in a delirium of shaking and sweat. Chen carried the young Belgian the last 5 miles to the Spanish town where Esteban had contacts. A doctor was summoned, one who asked no questions and accepted payment in gold coins. Laurent would survive, the doctor said, but he needed rest and proper medicine. Chen stayed for 2 days, making sure Laurent was stable. Then he continued alone to Madrid, carrying his documents and a letter from the OSS station chief in Lisbon that would get him through Spanish police checkpoints. Madrid was a strange city in 1943, nominally neutral but full of German and Allied spies watching each other warily. Chen made contact with the American embassy and was smuggled to Gibraltar aboard a neutral Swedish freighter whose captain had been paid handsomely to forget his extra passenger. From Gibraltar, an RAF transport flew him back to England. He landed at Nordholt Airfield outside London on November 19, 1943, 42 days after he had parachuted into Belgium. The documents he carried were immediately classified at the highest level. British scientists who examined Hoffman's specifications confirmed their worst fears. The German rocket program was real, sophisticated, and potentially devastating. The V-2 missile could carry a 1-ton warhead at supersonic speeds, making it impossible to intercept with existing defenses. The intelligence Chen had brought triggered a massive Allied response. Reconnaissance flights intensified over Piedmont and other suspected rocket sites. Plans were drawn up for bombing raids to destroy the facilities and disrupt production. Intelligence networks across Europe were tasked with gathering more information about the rocket program and identifying launch sites. In August 1944, the Germans began launching V-2 rockets at London and Antwerp. Over the following months, more than 3,000 rockets would be fired, killing thousands of civilians. But the attacks could have been far worse. Because of the warning provided by Hoffman's documents and Chen's desperate journey to deliver them, the Allies had time to prepare. Manufacturing facilities were bombed. Launch sites were targeted. Intelligence networks identified rocket storage depots that were then destroyed by Allied aircraft. The Germans' rocket program, which might have been a decisive strategic weapon if deployed a year earlier, became instead a terror weapon that caused suffering but could not change the course of the war. Chen never saw Laurent again. He received word through resistance contacts that the young Belgian had recovered and returned to Brussels after the liberation in September 1944. Laurent survived the war and became a teacher, spending his life educating children about the resistance and the cost of freedom. Marcel the smuggler continued his operations throughout the war, moving refugees and resistance fighters across occupied Europe with the same efficiency he had once used to move black market goods. He was killed in 1945, betrayed to the Gestapo by a rival smuggler in a dispute over money. Even in war, some things never changed. Esteban continued guiding refugees over the Pyrenees until the liberation of France. Estimates suggest he helped more than 200 people escape to Spain, asking nothing more than enough money to feed his family. After the war, he returned to his sheep and his mountains, refusing all honors and decorations, saying simply that he had done what any decent person would do. As for Klaus Hoffmann, the German technician whose conscience had led him to defect, his fate remained unknown. Chen learned years later that Hoffmann had been captured by the Gestapo in December 1943, betrayed by someone in the resistance network. He was executed at Plötzensee prison in Berlin in January 1944, never knowing that the documents he had provided would help the Allies prepare for and ultimately mitigate the V2 threat. Chen remained with the OSS through the end of the war, running other operations in Europe and later in the Pacific Theater. He received the Distinguished Service Cross for his mission, but the citation was classified and the medal presented in a closed ceremony with no press coverage. After the war, Chen joined the newly formed CIA and served for 20 years in various postings around the world. He retired in 1965 and settled in Virginia, where he taught history at a small college and never spoke publicly about his wartime experiences. In his later years, Chen would sometimes think about those 12 days traveling through occupied France with Marcel and Laurent, the cold mountain crossing with Esteban, and the weight of those documents pressed against his chest as he climbed toward Spain. He thought about the randomness of it all, how easily things could have gone differently. A checkpoint where the guards were more suspicious, a German patrol taking a different route, a smuggler less reliable or a guide less skilled. In the intelligence game, success often came down to small margins and unlikely combinations. A German scientist with a conscience, a Belgian teenager with courage beyond his years, a French smuggler with the right connections, a Basque shepherd who knew every hidden trail in the mountains, and an American officer willing to take the long way home through hostile territory because sometimes the obvious path was the most dangerous one. Chen died in 1989, taking most of his secrets to the grave. But in his personal papers, donated to the National Archives after his death, was a worn photograph of 4 young men standing together in a Brussels basement. Laurent, thin and intense, looking older than his 19 years. Marcel, cynical and calculating, but with something almost like respect in his eyes. Esteban, small and weathered, squinting at the camera as if unsure why anyone would want to photograph a simple shepherd. And Chen himself, younger than he ever remembered being, holding documents that would help save thousands of lives from rockets falling from the sky. On the back of the photograph, in Chen's careful handwriting, were 4 names and a single date, November 1943. And below that, a quote Chen had never been able to attribute to its source, but which seemed to capture everything about that desperate journey through occupied Europe. In the shadows of war, ordinary people become extraordinary, and extraordinary sacrifices become ordinary. We did what was necessary, not because we were heroes, but because there was no one else to do it. That, perhaps, was the real story of intelligence work in World War II, not the dramatic deceptions or brilliant schemes that history would remember, but the small, desperate acts of courage by people whose names would never appear in history books. The Belgian teenager who crossed mountains with a fever, the French smuggler who risked his life for money and found something like redemption, the Basque shepherd who asked for nothing but payment and gave everything anyway, and an American officer who took the long way home, carrying secrets through the darkness, because sometimes the mission was all that mattered, because those rockets would fall on London whether anyone knew about them or not, but with warning, with preparation, with time bought by desperate men making desperate journeys, at least some of the damage could be prevented. At least some lives could be saved. In the arithmetic of war, where lives were weighed against intelligence and courage measured in miles crossed under hostile skies, that was the only calculation that mattered. Chen brought the documents home. The warning was delivered. And somewhere in London, people who would never know his name lived, because he had taken the long road through occupied France, over cold mountains, into neutral Spain, and finally back to England. That was enough. That had to be enough. Because in the end, that was all any of them could do. Take the mission, run the risks, and hope that somewhere, somehow, it would make a difference. That the information would arrive in time. That the warning would be heeded. That the sacrifice would mean something. And sometimes, just sometimes, it did.